It's not just the people who have been incited to this violence, but it's the religious leaders of the Jews. It's the religious leaders of the Jews who engage in the very same actions, the very same blasphemy. Look in verse 41. In the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes and elders, were mocking him and saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross and we'll believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he delights in him. For he said, I am the Son of God." So the rulers, the chief priests, they're engaged in the mockery and the blasphemy of Jesus. Oh yeah, look at him now. He's hanging up there on that cross. If he'll just come down from the cross, yeah, we'll believe then. If he's the Son of God like he says, let God just come rescue him. That's where the cross is. Right in the middle of all of this violence, all of this vice, all of this blasphemy, all of this mockery. That's where Jesus is. Right in the middle of all of it. He's right in the middle of all the corruptness of character. In the midst of corruptness, these rulers, they had incited the people to this violence. They were guilty of mocking and blaspheming the very Son of God, and it's because they were so corrupt. Do you remember what led to how this all came about? It was them. They are the ones, for instance, that paid Judas the 30 pieces of silver. You remember that? Paid Judas the 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus. And then, of course, Judas felt bad about what he had done, tried to give them the money back, and they said, "We don't care. We don't care. You know, you did it now. It's, we're not worried about you." But they continued that same attitude all the way throughout the crucifixion scene. They're beginning at the very first verse of our chapter 27. When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus to put him to death. Whose idea was all of this? Well, of course, it was God's plan. But look who had the idea here in terms of the physical nature of this. It was the chief priest and the elders of the people. They conferred together. They said, let's see how we can put Jesus to death. They were corrupt in their dealings. Bribery, false witnesses, conferring how to kill somebody. And they were the chief priests and elders of the people. Verse 12 reminds us that he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, but he didn't answer. They were bringing up all manner of false charges against Jesus Christ. They were dealing corruptly. Then in the 20th verse, the chief priest and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to put Jesus to death. The crowds had to be persuaded, you see, to holler, "Crucify him and give us Barabbas." And who was doing it? It was the chief priest and the elders, dealing corruptly. Dealing corruptly. You know, all throughout the prophets, we've been studying the minor prophets some, and now we're studying Isaiah. And all throughout, you see this kind of theme going on with the leaders of the nation acting corruptly. You know, it makes me wonder, one of the verses that always has jumped out at me is from a prophet that we don't spend a whole lot of time with, Zephaniah. Chapter 3, verse 7, it makes me wonder, did these chief priests and elders, they were the religious leaders, did they not even think about what Zephaniah said, about what God said through Zephaniah? Surely you will revere me, accept instruction, so her dwelling will not be cut off, according to all that I have appointed concerning her. But they were eager to corrupt all their deeds. He says, I've told you, surely if I treat you right, surely if I bless you, surely if you look around and see how the nations around you have been punished, surely you'll reverence me, surely you'll revere me, surely you'll listen to my instructions, surely you'll do it so that you won't be cut off like it's been appointed you when you do evil. But they were eager to corrupt all their deeds. So now, look, that's where the cross is. The cross is right in the middle of all this violence, all this vice, all this blasphemy and mockery, all of this corruptness. So do you see the cross? You see where the cross is? It's right in the middle of all this evil. It's right in the middle of all this sin. But now think about this. The cross is right there in the world, not in heaven. Now, Jesus Christ, He certainly resides in heaven, but what I mean by this, Jesus didn't stay in heaven. Jesus came to earth right in the middle of all of this violence and sin. The cross didn't stay up. The death of Jesus is not up in heaven. It's right down here among us. The cross is in the middle of sin. It's not in the middle of righteousness. The cross is not some pretty picture. It's right in the middle of unrighteousness. Christ is righteousness, but His cross is right in the middle of the unrighteousness. In the religious world today, we see these images and get these ideas, and you see these little crucifixes. You know, people wear them and stuff sometimes to supposedly show their belief in the cross. You see these different religious organizations that have these big crosses and maybe some candles, you know, making this big, elaborate, and ornate show. But I tell you, the cross isn't in a cathedral between two candles. The cross is on a hill of disrepute between two criminals. It's not a pretty picture. Jesus Christ has the name above all names, but look how it came about. A cross right in the midst of all this ugliness. But you know what? All these people that we talked about this morning, these people in the crowd, these Roman soldiers, even these religious leaders of the Jews, guess who Christ died for? Every one of those folks. He died for them. As ugly as they made it, as violent as they were, as corrupt as they were, Jesus died for those people. Jesus died for sinners. And guess what? I'm one of them. Guess what? You're one of them. Oh, we may not be like the priests and the elders of the people and go around inciting people to violence with the words that they used. We may not even blaspheme or mock with the words they used. We may not be like the soldiers, and we may not be beating on anybody. But we could very well be like the crowd, couldn't we? Be led into doing things we ought not do, things we know better about doing. We might not be particularly vice-ridden. You know, we might not be engaged in all manner of weak, corrupt behavior. But nonetheless, we're sinners. Sin is just sin. Period. God, in what we call the Old Testament portion of our Bible, He reminded us in the period of the Kings that there are always those who will do wrong. Paul reiterates that for us in the book of Romans when he says all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. John emphasizes it again as we get near the end. If you say that you don't have sin, you're a liar. We all sin and fall short. Sometimes I think we know that intellectually, but we don't see it emotionally. Jesus died for all these violent people, all these blasphemous people, all these corrupt people. And we look at them and we say, how bad, how horrible. But He's the same for you and for me. Sin is sin. Sin is sin. Jesus came and was on that cross right in the middle of all of this so that these people and so that you and I can have a means to be forgiven, have a means to be redeemed. And that's where else the cross is, I want us to notice this morning. Yes, the cross was in the midst of all this violence and all this vice, all this blasphemy, all this corruptness. But I want you to see what else the cross was surrounded by. and that was forgiveness. Where's the cross? It's surrounded by forgiveness. You remember what Jesus preached over in the Gospel of Matthew? We call it the Sermon on the Mount. It begins there in chapter 5 of the Gospel of Matthew. Verse 44, Jesus preached this statement to those who would be His disciples. He said, I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends His rain on the righteous and the unrighteousness, or on the unrighteous. What's Jesus preaching? Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Have you ever heard the phrase, practice what you preach? Does Jesus practice what He preached? He says, pray for those that persecute you. What do we find when we look at the cross? Luke chapter 23, verse 34, Jesus was saying, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. Did Jesus practice what He preached? Here's the cross in the middle of all of this violence and blasphemy. All these people tormenting Him, torturing Him, putting Him to death, hanging Him up on the cross in one of the most violent deaths imaginable. Father, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing. In the center of all this hatred, all this violence, all this brutality, all this corruptness, what do you see shining in the middle of all of it? The attitude of Jesus Christ. Loving forgiveness. Forgiveness that's available to anybody who will turn to Him in belief and obedience. Jesus, after all, what did He come for? He says, I came to seek and save the lost. Isn't that what He said? What about His name that was proclaimed before His birth? Call Him Emmanuel. He's coming. Why? What's He going to do? To save His people from their sins. That's why Jesus is here. That's why the cross is here. Right there, surrounded by the brilliance of the love and forgiveness of God. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. So you see, the cross is about forgiveness, but it's also about belief, isn't it? The cross is right in the middle of belief. If you look at the story of the crucifixion, believe it or not, in the middle of all that violence and all that corruptness, you see some belief. You see some belief in there, in that story. You see the forgiveness of Jesus Christ, but you see the belief of those who finally come to a realization of what's happening. You know, during that time of the crucifixion, we had all the soldiers that were so corrupt, that were so violent, and that were so weak in character. But there was a man, a centurion. That means he had 100 of his guards under him, and they were the ones in charge of looking after the crucifixion scene. And you look at the centurion and his guards in Matthew chapter 27, verse 54. They see all the things that are going on with this crucifixion. They're Gentiles. They're paid soldiers, elite guards. And yet they see what's going on with the people and the rulers. They see what's going on with Jesus. And then they see the aftermath of what goes on as Jesus is hanging on the cross. In verse 54, now the centurion and these who were with him keeping guard over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake and the things that were happening, became very frightened and said, truly, this was the Son of God. It took something severe for them to realize, and we don't know whatever became of these guards or whatever became of the centurion, but we do know that they came to a realization. When they looked at what was going on, when they saw what was happening, they recognized the glory that they saw. Truly, this was the Son